So welcome to a special election-themed version of the Monday morning MotoGP podcast, and we are going to be talking about campaigns. No, we're not. We are going to be campaigning for several things in the motorcycle racing community. We are going to be campaigning for a young Japanese star to make it into MotoGP, to finally get the recognition he deserves. We're going to be campaigning for some major rule changes. We are going to be campaigning for a sprint grid shuffle. I've been saying it a few times. I think that the sport would benefit from having two different grids, one on Saturday, one on Sunday. We're going to explain exactly how that's going to work. And then we are going to campaign that an international superstar, besides Lewis Hamilton, should also buy a MotoGP team, just to give more visibility to the sport and honestly just bring him to the paddock every stinking week, please. So please join me here on the podcast live, 10 a.m. Pacific time, every single Monday morning after a MotoGP race. We do the podcast live here on TikTok, and then it is reposted over on YouTube if you miss it here. So please come join us live or watch the repost. Either way, like, follow, share, enjoy the show. Thank you so much. So like I said, we are going to be doing some campaigning. It's election season. The politicians are out there on the campaign trail trying to convince you that they're not complete crooks. It's a difficult job. Some people still idolize politicians. I don't know why. But on this channel, we only idolize motorcycle racing and motorcycle racing related topics. So I'm going to be doing some campaigning for some motorcycle topics that I think really need to be highlighted. And the first person we're going to be campaigning for here on the podcast is Moto2 MT Helmets MSI rider Ai Ogura. Number 79. You'll see I wear the 79 hat quite often on my TikTok videos. I'm a big fan of his. He's an immensely talented rider, and it's about time his name was mentioned more often when we talk about moving Moto2 riders into MotoGP. Just this last week, Fabio Quartararo was talking about this new Pramac Yamaha team. They said, who would you like to see sitting in that Moto2 in that Yamaha team? And he said, well, possibly a rookie, possibly someone like Sergio Garcia or Alonso Lopez. And Ai Ogura's name is not mentioned in that conversation. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I am campaigning that his name should be brought up for these types of seats because I think he is maybe the most talented rider in the Moto2 field and has been for a couple years. Now, last year for Ai Ogura was a wash. He was injured. He wasn't having a good time on the bike. It was not his year to be fast. It was just a recovery year. The year before, he challenged for the MotoGP World Championship. This year, he is back. He switches bikes. He's made an adaptation to that new chassis. He's made an adaptation to the new tires as fast as anyone, and he's riding at the front yet again. Put some respect on this dude's name. Now, I know it is a foregone conclusion that a lot of these Japanese riders, especially who've come up through Honda Team Asia and all of that, that it's kind of a foregone conclusion that they'll be moving into that LCR seat currently occupied by Taka Nakagami. It's kind of carved out for a Japanese rider. But that doesn't mean it has to be the only seat carved out for a Japanese rider. Why isn't Yamaha looking at Ai Ogura? Why aren't they trying to tempt him over? And I'm going to tell you a couple of reasons why I think he's actually a smarter choice than Sergio Garcia or Alonso Lopez or Fermin Aldeguer or any of those guys. And I've already said the first reason, adaptation. To be a fast MotoGP rider, you have to be able to adapt to the bike. Not just be a fast rider using your style on your bike. You have to be able to take what skills you have and adapt them to the motorcycle you're riding. We've seen that with Marc Marquez this year. We've seen how he's had to adapt his riding style to the Ducati. One of his first comments was, oh, I'm still riding this Ducati like a Honda. He had to adapt his riding style after 8 world championships. So a Moto2 rider who is already used to adapting to ever-changing climate is going to be a fast MotoGP rider, or at least has that potential. He's doing things now, having moved from the Kalex to the The new Pirelli tires have thrown a lot of people for a loop in Moto 2. We see people like Alonso Lopez, we see people like Aaron Canet burning out their tires, falling back. Tony Arbolino has not been able to figure out. It looked like he'd figured it out this last weekend, and then nope, to the back he went. Same thing with Celestino Vietti. These guys aren't adapting to these new tires the way that some of the more experienced riders are. Namely Ai Ogura, who still, at the end of a race, there is no one faster. Which brings me to the second reason why he should be in MotoGP, or at least be considered and mentioned along the names when we're talking about young riders who need to move up, is that he has this Enea Bastianini type of late race pace. He takes care of his tires. So he's not only fast, he's fast when it really matters at the end of races, when other riders haven't done as good a job on the tires. Ai is incredibly fast at the end of races. And that is something that MotoGP riders have to learn. We've seen Pedro Acosta, the first week out of Qatar, just said, screw the tires, I'm going to go as fast as I can, burn them out, right at the front, get some experience. And then you see how fast he fell back once those tires were gone. These guys struggle if you burn your tires out at the beginning of the race, you don't have anything left. It's something that you really have to manage in the late race portion of the weekend. Because it doesn't matter where you start. If you burn your tires out in the first 10, 15 laps of a race, you're not going to be there at the end. And Ai is the master of being smooth on the throttle, easy on the tires, and having something left at the end of the race. And also having something left at the end of the race while he's also moved forward through the pack. So he's contending for the podium. It's not like he's saving his tires to finish 15th. He's saving his tires to finish on the podium week in and week out. Which brings me to my third point, is that no matter where this guy starts on the grid, he always seems to find himself near or on the podium. He starts 15th, he's on the podium. He starts 18th, he's on the podium. He starts 8th, he's on the podium. He starts 5th, he wins races. This is the type of things you look at when you go, who should we bring up to MotoGP? This guy is legit. He's fast, he takes care of his tires, he's a smart racer, he's mature, he needs a seat in MotoGP. Now, okay, let's admit some facts. He has been with Honda most of his career. He is riding the Boscoscuro at MT Helmets, but he still has really deep Honda connections and really deep Honda loyalty. So it may be a personal choice that he's not jumping at opportunities to go to Ducati or go to Yamaha. That may be personal for him. But also, he has said publicly he wants to win a world title. And I think that's smart. I mean, you don't see that many Japanese riders on the grid. We just don't have that many. Right now in MotoGP, we have one. We have a couple in Moto 2. We have a couple in Moto 3. To be a Japanese rider and a world champion would be a huge deal for Ai Ogura. And he has a massive shot in Moto 2 to make that happen. MotoGP is going to be a lot harder to win a world title, especially coming in riding the LCR Honda. Like, no shot. But someone like Ai winning a Moto 2 world title is very, very realistic. He had one shot at it already. I think he's going to give Sergio and Furman and Joe Roberts all a run for their money in the second half of the year. To me, he's the title favorite because he just looks stronger every single week. He's so consistent. He doesn't make those big mistakes that we've seen Furman Aldeguer and even Sergio Garcia make. A bad weekend, he even said, this is not my favorite track. A bad weekend is Ai Ogura finishing second or third. We're going to see this kid fighting for the title all the way through the end of the season. So that is his priority. So maybe he's not looking to make the move to MotoGP until he accomplishes that personal goal. But all I'm asking, all I'm campaigning for is that the MotoGP teams start listing his name alongside of the likes of people like Sergio Garcia and Alonso Lopez, who was nowhere, by the way, this last week. I mean, he was nowhere. This is the guy we're talking about in MotoGP. He's very aggressive, very fast, but I don't think he brings all of the tools you need as a MotoGP rider. I don't think he's on the level yet of Aldeguer, Joe Roberts, Sergio Garcia, and my main man, Ai Ogura. Someone threw up in the comments, Jack Miller is the opposite of late race pace, which is funny because Jack used to be considered pretty good on the throttle. I remember an article that came out a few years ago calling Jack Miller a master of the throttle, and he was good at saving his tires. He seems to only move backwards these days. I am also campaigning this morning on the Monday Morning MotoGP podcast for some rule changes, and specifically this putting around the track during practice and qualifying, this touring, the tourist riding we see MotoGP riders do, especially during qualifying, that is reminiscent of what the Moto3 riders do when they're looking for a tow. Now in Moto3, it's a little bit, it's not acceptable because they penalized half the grid this weekend in Moto3 for putting around the track and looking for a tow and no one wanting to go first and everyone waiting for someone else to go. And it's some sort of strategy to go, well, I want to be the guy behind so I can get the slipstream and get the extra couple tenths down the straightaway. And half the grid was penalized for it. But we're seeing that translate over to MotoGP more and more as riders go, oh, let me steal one out of Marc Marquez's book and try to get a tow and get that extra tenth, half a tenth, and get me out of Q1 into Q2 on the back of someone else's effort. And again, I get it. It's within the rules. You're allowed to pull a slipstream behind another rider. You're allowed to follow them. Marc Marquez has done it for years. He harassed Maverick Vinales. He's harassed Fabio Quartararo and Pecco Bagnaia and Franco Morbidelli. He's notorious for following them around, being super annoying until you finally give up and just lead him around the track to a good lap time. He's obviously not doing that this year as much because the bike is a lot better. But with Honda, he was kind of forced to do that for the last few years. And we're seeing other riders now adopt that strategy, especially in Q1, where the margins going through to Q2 and not are so razor thin. These guys are looking for every advantage possible. And we saw some pretty scary incidents this last weekend with Stefan Bradl cruising, Marc Marquez coming through a section very, very fast, Stefan trying to get out of the way. They almost come into contact. We saw a couple weeks ago just riders all over the track jockeying for position, trying to find space on the track, but also just trying to find someone to slipstream behind. So I think they need to start penalizing these guys in MotoGP like they penalize them in Moto3. And I honestly would do it in the most unfair version. I'm campaigning for unfair penalties. I'm calling it the fuck around and find out penalty. In the rule book, we're just going to say if the stewards don't like what you're doing in practice and qualifying, as it comes to touring around the track, they can penalize you. I want one supreme arbiter. I will volunteer for the job. I want them to look at the replays and go, no, I think that kind of riding is bullshit. You're penalized. 110% of track speed. I don't care. But something has to be done to kind of wake up call some of these MotoGP riders who think it's okay to kind of putt around the track during qualifying, finding spots, annoying other riders. Listen, if you want to follow another rider and they're fine with it and you guys both go and ride, more power to you. But when you start stopping in the middle of the track and other riders are coming through on hot laps and you're distracting them from their hot lap, you're getting in their way, you're screwing up theirs, like, what are you doing? It's Bush League. It's amateur hour. Get your shit together. If you can't make a lap on your own, I mean, take some pride in your work, y'all. If you can't make a lap on your own, then maybe you don't deserve to be on the grid. Maybe you don't deserve to be into Q2. You're going to get into Q2 so you can run around on 11th or 12th? Congratulations, you're not 13th. I think they need to be punishing these riders and punishing them unfairly, making them start from pit lane, doing stupid things. Ruin their weekend for this stuff. They'll stop doing it. Or we could go back to what Moto E was doing in their pole position, where you get one lap. That's it. Each rider goes out one at a time. They get a warm-up lap and a hot lap. And that's their qualifying position. We could do it that way. That'll prevent people from getting a tow. You get one lap, one chance, put in your best time, and that's it. We could do that in MotoGP for a while. See how that changes things up. It's not the most exciting way to do qualifying. The Moto E qualifying wasn't the most exciting thing to watch in the world. But at least it would get the riders moving like you would have to ride. You would have to push really hard on that outlap to get the tires up to speed. And then you'd have 2 laps to really, really go. or we stagger these guys on the track and keep them away from each other. I don't know how we can officiate this. I just want it officiated. I don't want to see the touring, especially when you go to a MotoGP live event and these guys are going past your sector and they're just kind of like putting around on the motorcycle. It's annoying. I came here to hear fast, loud motorcycles. I came to see these guys drop an elbow in the corners. And here you are putting through my sector in front of my grandstand because you're looking for a tow. It's childish. It's silly. It needs to be dealt with. And I think if you start penalizing the riders in MotoGP and it starts costing them points, then their behavior will change quite a bit. I think in Moto3 it gets very hard because you give these guys long lap penalties and the group still rides together. You can win a Moto3 race with 2 long lap penalties. In MotoGP, you cannot. If you go through the long lap penalty loop in MotoGP, you're not finishing on the podium. Unless you've got some pace that's just out of this world. You have to be extra alien status, 3 seconds ahead of the entire field, which we haven't seen a lot of this year in MotoGP. I mean, Jorge Martin tried this weekend. He tried to pull the 3-second gap. Didn't quite work out for him. But I think that something's got to be done with this qualifying and practice touring. And I don't think there's anybody out there who really disagrees with me as far as enjoying the fact that these guys are putting around looking for a tow. It's just a bad look. It isn't entertainment. It isn't fun to watch. We want to watch the bikes go fast. Guys, if you make a mistake and you have to slow down, we get it. But you need to be getting back on the gas very, very quickly and getting the hell out of the way. We're not here to watch you wait for a tow. And we don't respect you for it either. So knock it off. Now, speaking of qualifying, the third thing I'm going to campaign for is something I've mentioned on my TikTok channel before, is shuffling the grid up for the sprint and the main race. Now, as you know, right now we have qualifying on Saturday, and that qualifying grid is how they start in the sprint and how they start in the main race. And the only difference between those two is penalties handed down. Because a lot of times the penalties only have any effect on the main Grand Prix. They don't have any effect on the sprint. So if you're given a three-place grid penalty for dawdling on the racing line in practice, that's usually assessed for the main Grand Prix, not the sprint. I would like to see a different grid for the sprint and the main race, just to change it up, just to make the weekend a little more interesting, just to throw another extra loop at the riders. You know, a little craziness, a little more unpredictability, because we're seeing these riders take that practice start at the sprint and then take that knowledge to the weekend, to the Sunday race, and go, okay, so we know we can make a start. We know we can be second or third around that first corner, even if we're starting 5th or 6th. And they take this information and they make their race better, which sometimes makes the field stretch out a little bit. I would like them to have 2 different grids, dealing with 2 different situations. Now, I've seen this proposed in different ways that I don't think work. I've seen people propose, well, maybe the result of the sprint should be the grid for the next day. And I'll tell you why that's a bad idea. I'll tell you why the way they finish in the sprint should not be the way the main race starts. One, again, we're rewarding the fastest rider and the fastest bikes in the race with better positions in the next race, which means we're going to get the faster guys at the front, way out front, than they were in qualifying. At least when we're talking about qualifying, maybe some of these riders have really fast 1-lap speed, but don't have the race pace to run at the front, or vice versa. And so now you have guys like Marc Marquez who can come through the field and make the race exciting. But if you just put all of the guys that had great race pace at the front of the grid, then this field is really going to get stretched out. And we're going to see guys winning by 5 or 6 seconds, because the ones who are going to be the fastest lap after lap are already starting at the front, rather than the guys who had great 1-lap speed and now they have to prove it with race pace. The other thing you're going to see is if the sprint dictated the main Grand Prix standings, you're going to see riders taking less risks in the sprint, because crashing out means starting at the back of the main Grand Prix, and that's where all the real points come from. We saw Pecco Bagnaia last year not be very good at the sprints and still win the World Championship. We saw Jorge Martin be dominant at the sprints and still not score enough points on Sunday to win the World Championship. And as much as you think these Saturday points are super important, they're not as important as Sunday, obviously. They're half points. So how much risk are some riders going to take, knowing that a mistake throwing it down the road means starting from the back of the grid? Some riders might throw caution to the wind and try to push up front, knowing that on Sunday they're going to have a good grid position. But one mistake puts you at the back of the grid. I think we would drastically see a change in how these sprint races are run. We'd see a more conservative approach from everybody, and I think we'd see much slower lap times overall. And I don't think we'd see great racing on Saturday. So here's my proposal. And I've said this before, so for anyone who's heard it before, I'm sorry for the repeat, but I do think this is the perfect way to get a different grid on Saturday than on Sunday. So currently in our new practice qualifying structure in MotoGP, we have free practice 1. Those lap times don't count to get into Q1, Q2. Then we have practice, which is basically practice 2. And those lap times, the top 10 automatically go through to Q2, and the rest have to fight in Q1, and then we go into qualifying. I think we change practice 2, just the title. The title of practice 2 changes from practice 2 to pre-qualifying, because it is already kind of a pre-qualifying session. These lap times count. We're making the riders put in a soft tire in order to put in a fast time so they get into Q2. So all we're doing, we're not really changing the format, we're just going to change the label. Pre-qualifying. So now, when you're putting in that fast lap in practice 2 in our new pre-qualifying session, that is going to be the grid for Saturday. That is the qualifying session for Saturday. There's no Q1, Q2 to go for the grid for the sprint. The qualifying on Saturday will be only for the main Grand Prix. Pre-qualifying session, those top 10 times you see that go through to Q2, and then everyone else behind them, that's how they're going to start the race on Saturday. So now you have one grid, because we see it change from Friday to Saturday. Some of the guys that go really, really fast on Friday don't find that extra step on Saturday to push into the top spots. So now you're making even more excitement on Friday. You're making that second session on Friday count for the main, not the main Grand Prix, for the sprint. So let's just look at what that would have done this weekend. I just want to take a little thought comparison to what that would have done this weekend. Bear with me as I look up the stats here. So we had practice 2 on, and this is not free practice 2, because again, this is confusing because there's free practice 1 and then there's practice and there's free practice 2. No, the counting practice, the Friday afternoon practice, the one that counts for moving into Q2 or not, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about pre-qualifying. If the sprint race grid would have been based on pre-qualifying, we would have had Maverick Viñales on pole, Jorge Martin and Miguel Oliveira on the front row, Alex Marquez, Pecco Bagnaia, Bastianini on the second row, Morbidelli, Acosta, De Gianantonio, 9th, and Brad Binder in the top 10. So we would have Maverick Viñales, Jorge Martin, Miguel Oliveira on the front row, if we would have used the Friday practice as pre-qualifying for the sprint. Now, the real qualifying for this weekend was Jorge Martin on pole, Miguel Oliveira second, Ralph Fernandez third. You see how different? Ralph Fernandez wasn't even in the picture on Friday, but somehow in qualifying does a good job, gets him through from Q1 into Q2 onto the front row. Changes the grid immensely from Saturday to Sunday, and that's what I am campaigning for. Because I think the sprint races, rather than just being a dressed rehearsal for the main race on the Grand Prix, it could be pretty exciting to see the riders rewarded for being fast on Friday. We see how Pecco Bagnaia goes through his weekend. With the exception of the Dutch TT, this weekend was very similar to Pecco. Same old Pecco. He's not going to be pushing on a Friday. He pushes just enough in that practice session on Friday to get into Q2. He's not near the top times until somewhere on Saturday. And he's not fully up to form, I think, until Sunday. But having a pre-qualifying session on Friday, that second practice, would reward those riders who get up to speed very, very quickly, who adapt to the track. And it would just make Saturday, I think, more interesting, because then Sunday is going to be an entirely different grid. We're not going to see the same starting positions. We're not going to see the same exact first 2 laps of the race unfold. These guys won't get a free look at what the Sunday Grand Prix is going to look like on Saturday. I want to shake it up, and I think it would be a good way to shake it up. So the last thing I'm going to campaign for on this podcast this morning is that I think MotoGP could use a couple of superstar owners in the paddock. Now, we've already heard the rumors about Lewis Hamilton coming in, buying Gresini Racing, joining the MotoGP paddock as an owner. I think it's a great idea. I don't know if it's going to happen as fast as the fans think it will. I think maybe in retirement, Lewis will look at it. Maybe it happens sooner. Who knows? Might be a good time to get into MotoGP, because if Liberty Media is going to pump some money into the sport, pump some visibility into the sport across North America, South America, really try to grow the sport in the next few years, now might be a great time to get in as an owner. You can buy a team for cheap and just watch it grow and sit back and collect all your monies. But there's one other superstar that I think should be considering buying a MotoGP team, and that's Keanu Reeves. This is a message and a campaign directly for Keanu Reeves and his lovely partner, Alexandria? Am I saying that right? I think y'all should be buying a MotoGP team too. They were on the grid this weekend in Germany. Keanu waved the checkered flag at the end of the race. They did an interview with Simon Crafar on the grid and blew Simon's mind, because they're not just casual fans of MotoGP. They're not just, oh yeah, we watch MotoGP, we're in the paddock because we got paddock passes and we want to feel fancy. They know the sport. Keanu Reeves knows MotoGP. He could replace me on this podcast. You'd probably watch it more. In fact, I know you would watch it if Keanu Reeves was sitting in this seat. His knowledge of motorcycles and MotoGP, his knowledge of what Simon does, the role of all of the different commentators, the role of the teams. He knew the people behind the scenes. He was starting to interview Simon. I expected him to start talking about pivot points and weight distribution and fork, front fork height and all that stuff. Swing arms and aero. He knows his stuff. And he's a huge fan of the sport, and I think he'd be a great ambassador for the sport as an owner. And I want Keanu Reeves in the paddock at MotoGP basically every weekend, because his enthusiasm, his raw nerding out. If you've seen some of the videos of him around the paddock just watching the bikes go by, this dude loves the sport. And we need people in the paddock that love the sport from that outside perspective that can share that with the world. I think, again, he would be an amazing ambassador to the sport. He would be an amazing team owner. He knows what he's talking about. He already owns a motorcycle company. This isn't a guy who doesn't know the motorcycling business. Does he know racing? I don't know. He'll hire people for that. It worked for Pitbull. Come on, we have Pitbull owner. We'd have a Lewis Hamilton owner. We'd have a Keanu Reeves owner. We put MotoGP on the frickin' map worldwide. And really, this is just honestly selfish. I loved hearing Keanu Reeves talk to Simon Crafar. He had him completely baffled, because he was like, oh my gosh, Keanu, I'm such a big fan. And Keanu's like, oh man, we're fans of yours. We love your technical data. We love the insight that you give in the commentary booth. And we love this about MotoGP. And we love that about MotoGP. And Simon was like, wow, normally I interview soccer players who kind of go, yeah, bikes go fast. That's cool. I like bikes going fast. And these people know what's going on in the paddock. They pay attention. They watch. He even referenced the MotoGP app. Keanu Reeves watches MotoGP through the MotoGP app just like we do in the United States. It's the best option. I've been telling you guys for a long time. That's how you need to watch it. Yes, you got to buy another subscription. Blah, blah, blah. Cancel Netflix. MotoGP app is worth much more than Netflix, and it's a lot cheaper. So if there's going to be one person out there that can breathe some extra life into MotoGP, it's Keanu Reeves. I'm campaigning directly to you, Keanu. This is a message directly to Keanu Reeves from the Horsepower Rodeo podcast. Come on in, find a team that wants your investment. Maybe you can team up with VR46. How cool would that be? Rossi and Keanu Reeves? But I think Keanu Reeves need to be in the MotoGP business. So once again, Keanu, if you're out there, if you're listening, I'm petitioning you to get interested, much like Lewis Hamilton is interested in MotoGP ownership. You should be interested in MotoGP ownership. Come into the paddock. You're welcome there. We want you there every single week. Please join us. So we're going to end the podcast this week just talking about the German Grand Prix. I don't do a lot of recaps here. The recap video will be up on TikTok and YouTube very quickly. But and I'm going to go through the whole weekend, Friday practice, Saturday, Sunday, all that stuff in that video. This podcast is more about the talking points, the fun stuff that comes out of a MotoGP weekend rather than just running through the weekend that you hopefully already watched. And one of the things I noticed this weekend is, you know, the critics, the two things the critics like to say this year is that, oh, that race was boring. That race was boring. And, oh, it's just the Ducati Cup. No one wins but Ducatis. As if either of those things are true. Now, I will give you that some races aren't exciting as others. I will give you that this last weekend's race in Germany was much more exciting than the race in Assen. But I also contend that if the races are boring, and I've said this on the podcast already, if the races are boring to you, you're not looking close enough. You're not looking at the lap times. You're not looking at the battles. You're not looking at the games of chess that are being played. And this last weekend in Germany was a great example of not every race needs 50 overtakes at the front to be exciting. Because what we saw this weekend was a chess match between Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin. Pecco said after the race, it looked like the guys in front of me were using too much rear tire too early in the race. So I decided to go into save tire mode. And he did. He kind of sat there in third behind Franco Morbidelli. He moved into a comfortable second. He kept that gap around, 8/10 to Jorge Martin most of the race. He's like, oh, it's a boring race. They're not challenging each other. Well, he knows that if he burned out his tire moving up to challenge Jorge Martin, that he wouldn't have anything left for him at the end of the race. There'd be no shot to move through because his tire would be shot. So he decided to play the patient game. He decided to play the game of chess, and he would push every so often just to kind of test Jorge and see the response. And they were running very, very similar lap times, and they kind of got to a place where they were running almost identical lap times. And I think Pecco knew, okay, I can run this lap time and not burn out my tires. And then with 5 laps to go, he started to push. And with 3 laps to go, we really started seeing that gap come down. And so did Jorge Martin. Jorge Martin saw that gap coming down on his pit board. Pecco was closing him in. And at that point, Jorge was probably having rear tire trouble, knowing that he was just trying to get to the end of the race. 2 laps to go, let me just hold on to this lead. And when you start thinking of those other things, when you start, kind of splitting your focus and going, oh, there's someone coming behind me, and now I have to worry about my tires, and I need to push a little faster than this pace I've been running, mistakes are made. And that's what Jorge did. He made a mistake. Crashes out in that first corner. Pecco Bagnaia gets the win. Not handed to him. Not, well, Jorge Martin was just riding around the track and then lost the front, and that's it. And that's not the story. The story is that pressure from behind him. If he was 5 seconds clear of anyone else, you think he would have crashed? Maybe. I doubt it. He would have been in very comfortable pace mode at that point in the race, knowing that he was going to cross the line first, knowing that he doesn't have to take any unnecessary risks, knowing that he doesn't have to brake extra late into that first corner to try to keep Pecco behind him. But when that pressure is building behind you, that's part of the chess we talk about in MotoGP. Those are the types of errors that are forced in a MotoGP weekend when someone's leading a race. When we say manage the gap, manage 0.6 a second back, they're feeling that pressure when they start seeing that gap come down, especially at the end of races. You don't think guys are looking at their pit board and they see, one lap they see Marc Marquez 0.6, and then they see Marc Marquez 0.3, and then they see Marc Marquez 0.0. You don't think that gets into their head? You don't think that makes them ride a little different? You don't think that can force a mistake? You're absolutely wrong. So when we see races like Assen and we see the chess match, but it doesn't play out in the way it played out in Germany, it's not that it was a boring race, it was that that tactic just didn't work out that time. And every tactic of every race is a little bit different. So if this German Grand Prix would have ended in a similar way of Assen, if Jorge Martin just being able to manage that gap, playing that game of chess, keeping Pecco Bagnaia behind him, winning the race, the critics, oh, it was a boring race. Oh, nothing happened at the front. Nah. Or you don't understand it, and you don't appreciate it. And trust me, I love exciting races. I love racing it with overtakes. I love watching the guys battle wheel to wheel and elbow to elbow. I love it. But not every game is a 10 home run slugfest. Sometimes pitchers pitch no-hitters. Sometimes there's defensive-minded games. And maybe you don't like those as much, but if your first response is, oh, that was really boring, I can't help you. I think you need to look deeper. So maybe I can help you. Look deeper. Look deeper into what actually went on in the race. Luckily for us, the German Grand Prix was super exciting. There was overtakes and battles all over the place. There was battles for 1-2, battles for 3-4, battles for 5-6. We had Marc Marquez yet again coming all the way through the pack to the front on the podium. Alex Marquez rode an extremely strong race. I don't even know if Alex knew he had that in him. The other criticism about the Ducati Cup, I'm not going to talk about this again after this, I think, because it's such a stupid argument. Now, people will say MotoGP is boring and it's going the wrong direction because only Ducati is dominant. Then they'll say there's no close racing in MotoGP. Well, one way to make close racing in any motorsport is to make all of the machinery equal. If you made all of the machines equal and the only difference was the riders, the racing would be a lot closer because these guys are very, very talented motorcycle riders. So the gap between the best rider on the grid and the worst rider on the grid isn't all that much. We're dealing in fractions of a second here in MotoGP. We're saying, 0.3 of a second is a big lead, is a big gap in MotoGP. The margins are very thin. So if you wanted close racing, what you actually want is all the riders to be on very, very equal machinery. So it would make sense if we just said, okay, MotoGP, now everyone rides a Ducati or everyone rides a Yamaha, and now the racing will be closer. So to say simultaneously, oh, I just want the racing to be closer and more competitive, and I'm really upset there are 8 Ducatis on the grid, and only Ducati wins. Well, which one do you want? Because the reason it's so close at the front between Martin and Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Marquez and Alex Marquez and Digi's name's thrown into this mix, and Franco Morbidelli showed some speed. The reason these guys are all very fast is they're on very similar machinery. So do you want close racing or do you want, I don't know what y'all want. The second thing is, yes, there are 8 Ducatis on the grid. There are 4 2024 machines, there are 4 2023 machines. There are 8 different riders riding them. Why do we care that one brand wins it? I don't show up to a race weekend and be like, oh, I hope a Ducati wins. I hope a generic Ducati wins the race. I'm fans of the racers. I'm cheering for Pecco that weekend. Do I have a Ducati brand loyalty or a Yamaha brand loyalty? Sure. But I'm not showing up to a race weekend and going, yay, Yamaha, #1, win the race. The Yamaha's not riding the motorcycle. The Yamaha is the motorcycle, and Fabio Quartararo is riding the motorcycle, and that's who I'm cheering for. So there are 8 Ducatis on the grid this year. Good news for the haters, there's only 6 next year. So there'll be less. I personally don't care if Ducati is 1 through 8 on a Sunday. They can take all top 8 spots. I don't care, because they're different riders riding each of them. The competition is still there. It is still a competition. Just because they're riding the same brand doesn't mean there's no competition in MotoGP because the same team wins all the time. No, the same team doesn't win all the time. Tell Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin that either one of them winning is the same team winning. I think they'd disagree with you. Marc Marquez is on the Gresini Ducati team. Jorge Martin, Pramac Ducati. Pecco Bagnaia, factory Ducati. De Gianantonio Bezzecchi, VR46 Ducati. Those are different teams. Those are teams that rent machinery from a manufacturer. They fly the Ducati flag, sure. But on Sunday, they want to beat each other. There's a competition. There's no loyalty between them. They look at each other's data and steal. Oh, Jorge Martin's strong here? How do we become strong here? It makes the competition more fierce between them. So who cares what brand is on the motorcycle that finishes 1 through 8? Who gives a shit? The Ducati Cup. Oh, it's Ducati winning every week. No, it's not. It's a rider winning every week. It's a motorcycle rider that has made their machine the best for that week. It's a motorcycle rider that gets to stand on the podium. The manufacturer dude doesn't even get to stand on the step. He has to stand to the side. He gets to accept his trophy, and Ducati gets to accept a lot of trophies. But the people on the podium are the riders. I don't care if they're all riding the same brand. We can do that. In Moto 3, they're in effect mostly riding all the same motorcycle. In these junior cups, they're all riding the exact same motorcycle. We can go to that style of racing if you want. But that's not what MotoGP is about. MotoGP is also about the engineering side. MotoGP is about building the best bike, being the most innovative team out there, bending the rules to the point of breaking them, and seeing who does it best at the end of the day. Then finding a very talented rider to ride your motorcycle. So who cares if Ducati is 1 through 8? I don't care. I'm interested in the Riders' Championship. That's the one we're always talking about. When we say so-and-so is the world champion, we're always mentioning the Riders' Championship first. The Constructors and the Teams title is second. The most important title, the one that everyone remembers, is the Rider title. Who won the Constructors' Championship in 2004? Do you remember? 2008. Who won it? 2009. Who won the Constructors' Championship or the Teams' Championship? You would probably have to think first, well, who won the Riders' Championship that year? And then you'd be able to figure out maybe who won the Teams' title, because it's a long time. Very, very well connected, right? So I think it's time to let go of this Ducati Cup nonsense and realize that there are 8 different riders on those 8 different bikes. And who cares what brand they are? They're different teams. There's 2 riders per team. And anyway, next year there'll only be 6. So you can maybe finally just chill out and enjoy the racing. And if you still find the Ducati Cup boring, there's always NASCAR. All right, thank you so much for joining me on the Monday Morning MotoGP podcast. We are live here 10 a.m. on TikTok every Monday morning after a MotoGP weekend, and then we repost this podcast in its entirety on YouTube later today, so you can see it there, along with all the old episodes of Monday Morning MotoGP. I have a playlist on the YouTube channel of all those episodes, so if you ever missed them live, there they are, along with other content and other fun stuff. Please, if you aren't already, like, follow, share, mash all the buttons so you can get all the MotoGP goodness you can possibly handle here on the podcast, on TikTok, and over on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a great day.